welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for the very first Works That Shaped the World seminar for 2021. It's really exciting for us to be here again to run this series, and we hope that you enjoy the seminar tonight. So my name is Kylie Message. I'm a Senior Fellow in the HRC and I'm the Associate Dean for Research in the College of Arts and Social Sciences at the ANU. I'll be chairing the session tonight. I'm going to start by acknowledging and celebrating the first Australians on whose lands we're meeting. So I'm on unceded Ngunnawal and Ngambri lands, and I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. As I mentioned, Works That Shaped the World is, well, we're having the first episode tonight. It's a series run by the College of Arts and Social Sciences and the Humanities Research Centre. It's a series that aims to give experts from diverse interdisciplinary fields a platform to shed insight into some of the astonishing creations that have shaped people's lives and how we see, think and know about them. The theme for this year's series of Works That Shaped the World is Medical Humanities. And our topic today is Medical Humanities from Chart to Art. Our presenter is Dr. Claire Hooker. Claire is Senior Lecturer in Health and Medical Humanities at Sydney Health Ethics and Chair of the Arts Health Network of New South Wales and ACT. She's an innovator in effective communication in healthcare, and her work combines expertise in creative arts research, critical humanities scholarship, cognitive psychology approaches to risk perception and communication, and the history and philosophy of science to produce practical methods and new insights into ethical communication in health. Claire's published widely on risk communication in relation to infectious diseases and has recently been prominent in the media in relation to COVID-19 responses. So it's great to have Claire here. So thank you for making the train trip across from Sydney to Canberra. We actually have Claire here in person and in a strange kind of slightly confusing state. We're all in the same building in different rooms, which is a little bit odd, I have to say. So we've got Claire starting and she's going to give us a little bit of an overview of some of the multiple histories of the medical humanities. She's going to focus on 3 moments in the history of medical humanities to consider whether and if so, how the medical humanities have changed medicine. Beginning in 1978 with the publication within 6 months of each other of 2 defining books, the first being Samuel Shem's The House of God and Thomas Beauchamp and James Childress's The Principles of Biomedical Ethics as the second book. This talk will discuss what people of the time, that is the late 1970s, found newly articulated in these works and the first wave of the medical humanities that followed. The talk will conclude with 2 anecdotes of students and performance art as a means of exploring new transformative opportunities for health and healing. So I think this is it's perfect timing for us to be talking about the medical humanities, I think, in 2021. It's great to have Claire to commence the discussion on this theme, and I'll pass over to her. One thing I will say is that we have got plenty of time for questions and answers and discussion following Claire's talk. What we'll do is, if you can please put your questions in the Q&A field on the left. Claire and I will manage those after the talk as they come up. So I'll pass over to Claire now and welcome her. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you so much for having me and to give you the privilege of kicking off this very exciting and very timely season of exploration in the medical humanities. And I will begin by sharing a screen in the now time-honoured manner. And confusingly, there was more than one screen to share, but this looks like the right one. So I would like, presuming I can make this work. Okay. All right, yes, I would like to add my own acknowledgement of country. The image that you see is of the rare pink flannel flowers that only bloom if there has been devastating bushfire, an immense amount of smoke, and then a substantially wetter than normal year of rain. And that's what we have experienced in my home of the Blue Mountains, which is the land of the Gundungara people. Those rare pink flannel flowers have only recently finished blooming. So I would like to pause to acknowledge the traditional owners whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land since men and women awoke from the great dream. We honour the presence of those ancestors who reside in the imagination of this land and whose irrepressible spirituality flows throughout all creation. That acknowledgement comes from the Creative Spirits website, and I wrote my talk today with that paradigmatic framework in mind. And I'd also like to acknowledge that I have the really exciting privilege of having one of those really, those post-COVID exciting moments where I haven't travelled anywhere for so long, and now I'm here in Canberra, and I'm very thrilled to be on the lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, also unceded territory. So, the medical humanities. In terms of changes in the world, the medical humanities, and really I would like to say the health and medical humanities, or even embracingly the health humanities, are representative of fairly extraordinary shifts in medicine and healthcare that have occurred over the last half century, from paternalistic models of care through to what is now patient-centred. And so I am using this talk to hold for all of us a reflective moment about what the medical humanities are, due in part to their exponential expansion over the last 15 years. And indeed, there really has been an exponential expansion. I don't seem to be able to work this very well. This year is really exciting for the medical humanities in Australia. On Thursday, the 3rd of June, which is only 2 weeks away, the Australasian Health and Medical Humanities Network will be launched. As you see on my screen, you can register to join that launch. I really hope you will. This is a fabulous initiative of Professor Elizabeth Stevens from the University of Queensland. And I should mention that coming up in July after that, Dr. Charon, who's here at ANU, will be hosting a full-day symposium exploring the visual medical humanities, and that's along with a bunch of other fairly exciting events both here and elsewhere around Australia in the creative arts and health. So actually there's a lot of momentum right now in Australia, and this series is kind of going to be the beginning that carries us through for the rest of the year. Now, what is or are the medical humanities? During the last 30-40 years, there have been several points at which scholars and practitioners have stepped back and tried to reflect on or define the identity of the medical humanities, usually with a view to deepening either advocacy for its role and to make an argument for why they are important, or to deepen our capacity to frame and understand that impact in and of itself. One constant across all of those decades, although the definitions have changed, it has been the desire that the medical humanities will change medicine. And along with that desire, a little bit of worry that perhaps they will not. So how have the medical humanities changed medicine? And could we tell? In a way, the medical humanities offers a little microcosm of the defense of the humanities in general, the value of the humanities in general. And when I Googled medical humanities, because I thought someone will have written a beautiful definition, I've read many of them over the years. Ironically enough, it was my own paper who was the top hit. So I've taken a little quote out of that and put that on the screen before you to show that the medical humanities from a decade ago explores, or was thought to explore, the human side of medicine, also physician experience, and that there is a great deal of hope vested in it, that by paying attention to human interactions, giving space to creativity, to something that stands against the reductiveness and disenchantments of quantitative sciences, there will be a capacity to create more compassionate, more capably communicative doctors, and in this way lead to better health outcomes for patients. And that focus at the bottom in bold has been the main focus, I think, for the medical humanities through most of these past decades. This image is from the extraordinary work of my artist colleague, Vic McEwen from the CAD Factory, a artist-led organisation of socially engaged artists in the Riverina in Narrandera. The image is of a specimen that's held in the National Museum here in Canberra, and that photograph has been projected onto the waters of the Murrumbidgee. The medical humanities have always been somewhat variegated. This is my, I'll move on to this slide for this. They are incredibly diverse, something of a motley crew perhaps, or a little bit ragtag. And in that way, it has perhaps been a field that has been more variable than it has been coherent. But the argument that I want to present to you today is that actually, when we do this stepping back, the medical humanities has always been connected to larger moral moments. And my story for you today is going to focus on some of those moments. So what I'm going to tell you is a story about the development of the medical humanities, just one story. But the point of the title of my talk is that there isn't a single story. And many of you, I'm sure, will know that by rejecting the notion of a single story, I have taken inspiration from the much watched TED Talk by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie called The Danger of a Single Story. If you have not seen this TED Talk, her basic premise starts with herself as a young child growing up in Nigeria, reading English novels and wanting to be a writer. And so she wrote, and her writings were about children who played in the snow and ate apples and drank ginger beer, absolutely none of which featured in her actual Nigerian experience. And that's because she had a kind of single story in her head about what children's stories should look like or be about. Later, she would find that those single stories can be somewhat harmful because when she went to meet, for example, her houseboy's family, she was amazed to discover them to be people of skill and colour and creativity because her single story about them was one of poverty and deprivation. And she says, as you see in the quote on your screen, a single story creates stereotypes. And the problem is that those are, it's not that they're untrue, but they're incomplete. They make one story be the whole story. Especially, of course, she has been pushing back against the single story that the West tends to have about Africa, again, as a nation simply of destructive wars, famine, and poverty. And she goes on to analyse that by identifying that how stories are told and who tells them are really dependent on power. And power is the ability to not just tell a story about another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. She cites Palestinian poet Murad Barghouti, who says that if you want to dispossess a people, the simplest way is to tell their story but to start it with secondly. What does he mean by that? He means that you leave out the important precursors. You neglect to speak of what came first. Start your story with secondly, and the arrows of the Red Indians are the aggressors, and the guns of the whites are entirely the victim. Similarly, Victor Jara's songs will be the shameful thing, not Pinochet's bullets that killed so many thousands in the Santiago Stadium. So I'm holding all of these thoughts in my head while I go on to construct some stories about the medical humanities. And she identifies that stories matter, that stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, as is the case with the single story that the West tends to have about Africa. But stories can also repair that dignity. Now, when I wrote the abstract for this talk, I thought the point of starting with the danger of the single story was largely to make the point that the medical humanities are so heterogeneous that there cannot be a single story about what they are, so I'm using they, a plural rather than a singular, or what they do, or what their history has been. But as I came to write this talk, I began to think that actually Adichie's talk might capture the original mission of the medical humanities itself. The medical humanities, I think, began by wanting to disrupt the single story that medicine had about patients and had about illness and about itself as the sole possessor of the knowledge that could bring cure and restitution. In other words, medicine had and told the single story. So in that spirit, I'm going to start now on my story about the trajectory of the medical humanities. It's not a single story about a single work that changed this world, but instead it's a story about connections between several, in fact, many of such works. In the process, I hope, touching some of the nerve centres of the field's development. Indeed, writing this talk turned out to be research more than I expected it to be. By embarking on the project in this way, I noticed coherencies that I hadn't considered before. And so, in the end, those coherencies will be offered to you as a kind of single story. One that, as the abstract promised, I will do in 3 moments. So here we go with moment 1, which is 1978. So I just want to situate the first wave, I've called it first wave medical humanities, in 1978. It was led almost entirely by physicians, and they were concerned that they received very good technical training, as one doctor put it to me, but actually had no education, by which he meant capacity to understand and engage fully with the human side of patients. There was a sense that the patient was being displaced or replaced by flows of data and by technology. And there was also a sense of unease within medical circles about growing critiques of medical authority and of patient disempowerment, along with some concern about the disruptions of care and especially the loss of touch. And people might call to mind some of the activism around home births or midwife-led births or resistance to caesarean sections or to stirrups or to resistance at that time of the what would become the anti-psychiatry movement. The first institute for the medical humanities was actually founded in 1973 at the University of Galveston, Texas. In 1974, the first article that contained just a tiny little peep of qualitative research was published in The Lancet by poet and surgeon Professor Miles Little. So that's to set the scene. as the backdrop to the 1978 publication of our first seminal text, which is Beauchamp and Childress's extraordinarily famous The Principles of Biomedical Ethics. So Beauchamp and Childress were two students who met in the mid-1960s at Yale universities, where they were studying religion, but were recruited to teach at the Kennedy Center on the world's first intensive course in bioethics. At the time, they were captured by the then dominant view that deontology and consequentialism were irreconcilably opposed theories between which one had to choose. And they had different choices to each other, but not a huge amount of dedication to either of those choices. They quickly realized that their different approaches could generate and sustain a common set of ethical principles for bioethical discourse and practice. And that insight was the beginning of the book, The Principles of Biomedical Ethics. So they became aware of the need for an approach that recognized the value of moral philosophy or of ethical theory for practical judgments, but that didn't privilege one type of theory over all others. And they also thought that several moral principles provided significant common ground relevant to judgment in the biomedical sciences, and that these principles could not be convincingly ranked a priori in a hierarchical order. So the four principles did just that. It was a book that was seeking common ground and to make moral philosophy available for doctors to use in practice. It focused on convergence and it sought universalism. In the third edition, they argued mainly for a convergence of ethical theories around the principles, and in the fourth and subsequent editions, without abandoning the convergence thesis, they extended it to argue that the principles can and should be regarded as deriving historically from a common morality, which they defined as a universal morality to which all morally serious persons subscribe. The late John Arras, who was a somewhat friendly critic, suggested that the principles of biomedical ethics was rather like the Borg in Star Trek. The Borg is a half machine, half human creature with a highly developed group consciousness, so that anyone the Borg captures is automatically assimilated into the collective, and resistance is useless. In this way, the principles of biomedical ethics slowly assimilated all of the variety of ethical approach and theory that were developed over its many, many subsequent editions. I've taken many of those words, by the way, from Beauchamp and Childress's own reflections on the principles of biomedical ethics, which were 40 years later, which were published in 2019. So interested listeners will be able to search for 40-year reflections on both the texts that I'm discussing at the moment. The four principles what seemed very broad at the time it was written. And why? Because it added the four principles were autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, and justice. And by adding patient autonomy and justice to medicine's traditional focus on non-maleficence and beneficence, it seemed to be taking a very broad stance. It asked doctors that they do more to justify their decisions than to appeal to their intentions to be beneficial. This intersected with the concerns of the early medical humanities at the time, which was to cultivate that natural beneficial orientation of doctors in a fashion that that often on purpose followed in the footsteps of humanistic surgeon William Osler, to use literature, the fine arts, history of medicine, and philosophy to maintain the empathy and sensitivity with which students came into medical school. The four principles have been extensively critiqued But in the process, they have spawned an unbelievable wealth of flowering of scholarship in biomedical ethics. And indeed, they continue to do so. I have a slide that I'm looking at the moment from 2012, which looks at how you could measure the 4 principles and thus determine if they are predictive of ethical decision making. And that's by no means the last of those. While the field of clinical ethics blossomed and burgeoned, and many analyses have taken very critical positions of Beauchamp and Childress, what they did do was introduce basic features that have remained absolutely normative in how to have ethical practice, such as the notion that the right way to go about doing this is to set out a clearly defended position in logical, philosophical, and academic prose, identifying how and under what circumstances one principle or set of duties or values, which might be in conflict with another, and which should be prioritised and on what basis. And that normative way of going about things, the genre, the language, the tone, in some ways became a single story about what ethical professionalism in medicine was all about. And what I want to do now is to point out that even at the time, it was far from being the single story. And there's no way to do it, no better way to do it in my view, than to juxtapose it with the other seminal transformative work that was published in 1978, which is Samuel Shem's novel, The House of God. I'm hoping that many of you listening or watching will be certainly familiar with The House of God, which was a novel that acquired cult status extraordinarily quickly. If you don't know it, it follows the story of Dr. Roy Bash, an intelligent but naive intern who is working in a hospital called the House of God after completing his medical studies at the BMS, aka Best Medical School. In the novel revealed just how brutal, uncaring, and unmoored from its supposed principles of working the actual practice of medicine, as experienced by interns in the late 1970s, actually was. These are nowhere better revealed than, and I have a list of similar appreciations 40 years later of retrospectives looking back on the House of God. It's the difference between what one is supposed to do as an intern and the actual way to have some approximation of actually providing care for medicine is advanced through the character of the fat man, who is a registrar who looks after Roy Bash and the other interns by offering them the rules of the House of God. The laws of the House of God, I have all 13 of them up on my screen, but if you're not familiar with them, the very first of them is that Gomers don't die. So it is arguable about whether Shem invented or merely popularized the term Gomer, which stands for get out of my emergency room. These are mostly elderly patients who the job of the good emergency room doctor is to try and get them out of their ward as quickly as possible, because they will only ever cause you trouble. I won't read through all of the laws of the House of God, but they include such laws as the only good admission is a dead admission. If you don't take a temperature, you can't find a fever. Show me a BMS or Best Medical student, a student at the Best Medical School, who only triples my work and I will kiss his feet. If the radiology resident and the medical student both see a lesion on the chest x-ray, there can be no lesion there. And the delivery of good medical care is to do as much nothing as possible. The House of God is extraordinarily funny It is ribald, it is shocking, and it was deeply scarring and revealing. And many of those same themes, that less medicine is better medicine, that physical examination procedures are more performative than informative, and that hospital administrators give lip service to combating burnout while quietly supporting its underlying causes, remain true today. And they are the reasons why this particular novel captured so much attention. The book also made it clear that another of the rules of the House of God is that physicians complete suicide, which is what happens to one of Roy's friends in the story of the book. So my question was, could we use the 4 principles by Beauchamp and Childress to make sense of what happens in the House of God? Or could we use the House of God to make sense of any of the issues approached by Beauchamp and Childress? I suppose it is possible that we could go through many of the vignettes and episodes of the House of God to identify the 4 principles. For example, Roy Bash's learning that the best way to look after his patients is to do as much nothing as possible, sometimes in defiance of his resident Joe's requirements, might be understood as the exercise of non-maleficence, perhaps the paradigmatic exercise of non-maleficence. But that seems somewhat unsatisfying, and it falls short of capturing why the book stays with us, the reason it gained cult status. It doesn't notice the bitter, slightly hysterical moral bite of its dark humour, nor does it approach the grey ambivalence that lingers around its apparently happy conclusion. It is therefore my contention that the House of God perhaps better explains the 4 principles than the other way around. It illuminates in a way we can grasp the reason for why we might need to use clumsy set of common rules like the 4 principles that can be so loosely defined as to be adaptable to personal and institutional needs. It acknowledges the constrained relationships, moral distress, mental ill health that sit like a shadow under those physicians making decisions in rational, balanced, reflective equilibrium. Professor Miles Little, author of that first qualitative paper in The Lancet, wrote that the House of God was very funny, but also very chastening for anyone who read the reports of research misconduct that had prompted the bioethics movement into being. So that's my first moment. In 1978, 2 seminal texts that I attacked 2 quite different sides of the moral complexities of medicine. Following, what they both did though was, as I say, they prompted the flowering of movements in bioethics and humanities. Do this. In the first wave of the medical humanities, therefore, after this, medicine perhaps acquired more stories. In fact, I think it acquired a second story. The first story it had had was one of medical paternalism, where doctors knew what was best and ordered their patients to behave accordingly. But in the 1980s and in the 1990s, we had the flowering of narrative medicine. Arthur Frank published his famous work, The Wounded Storyteller, which I think might be on the next slide. Yes. Which showed 3 archetypes of illness narratives. Rita Charon published her absolutely paradigmatic work, practical work of narrative medicine, and identified this concept of the parallel chart. The parallel chart is literally a second and subjugated story. The story that the doctor might write off record that captured all of the meaningful humanistic actions belonging to their own experience and to the patients. So we might say that the first moment of medical humanities, what it accomplished was to acquire at least a second story, even if it never disrupted the power of physicians. Let's move on then to my second moment. I've called my second moment Towards Sensibility, and I have put a date on it, 2011, but it is a less well-defined date than my first moment in 1978. So I've mentioned already that the first wave of the medical humanities had a great flourishing in a paradigm that was focused primarily on exploring illness experience, developing a humanistic medical practice, and thus enhancing professionalism and cultivating empathy. This flowed in parallel with work in bioethics that focused on phronesis, or the exercise of practical wisdom, that looked at the development of virtue ethics as underpinning physician and clinician practice, and explored the potential for values-based medicine. There is just a wealth of publications that explored these themes in this period. It was, in many ways, also the age of the pathography. That is, the story, the publication of illness narratives, as well as of qualitative research in health and medicine. And well-known pathographies from that period include The Beautiful and Brief Diving Bell and the Butterfly by Jean-Dominique Bauby, which explored someone's experience with locked-in syndrome, and Margaret Edson's fabulous play Wit, which was made into a very powerful film starring Emma Thompson. And in case we get too serious, I've put one of my own favourite works juxtaposed against these, which is Miriam Engelberg's Cancer Made Me a Shallower Person, the start of just an absolute explosion of graphic novels that also dealt with illness experience. In 2006, we saw the foundation of the two extensively funded Wellcome Centres for the Medical Humanities, one at Durham University and one at King's College London. Now, although the medical humanities of this era were not dealing directly with bioethical issues such as virtue ethics, the central issues that were being explored and grappled with in all of these explorations, primarily of narratives, were very often indeed about values, about the nature of integrity, about what responsibility might mean. I would say that in this particular period, a rich conception of some of these discussions was offered by Martha Nussbaum and her colleagues in their discussions of how literature might be understood as a unique means of doing or exploring ethics, that literature has unique capacities to provide ethical insight and ethical theory. Ideas that she published in her collection, above all, Love's Knowledge, Essays on Philosophy and Literature. Her central thesis in this particular work was that novels, of a good quality at least, were able to do things that an academic essay or a piece of moral philosophy could not do. They would focus attention on the primacy of the particular. They could look at the incommensurability of valuable things. They could understand the context embeddedness of relevant features and the ethical relevance of unique particular persons and places. They were able to understand actions and agency and the moral character and integrity of those within the overarching arc of a person's trajectory, development, and life. They put primacy on the ethical value of the emotions and allowed them to be ways of becoming, as she put it, finely aware and richly responsible. These particular set of ethical aspects that are in some ways very crucial to the medical humanities work of this period fitted within feminist approaches to bioethics, and in particular to the advent of care ethics, such as that by Joan Tronto and by others. I have an incorrect title there because I was going to look at several of those that came from the nursing literature by Virginia Helt, which similarly influenced which similarly identified the importance of relationships, of orienting ethics not around principles, but about caring interactions and the particularities of people and places. Mind you, the medical humanities of that period was certainly, in my view, hardly feminist. But it was influenced by new perspectives from women who gave some articulation to issues around power or identity or finding a patient voice. It was in some ways a difficult time, as we might see by considering, oh yes, I'll go back into this particular part of the narrative by telling you a story before I move on to an articulation of one of the challenges. The Beijing Forum had panels on the medical humanities. It was held in fact, 2010. At the Beijing Forum, it was obvious that the medical humanities had grown globally, and that except, however, there was considerable resistance in Australian medical schools, I must say, during this period. But it was being taken up rapidly in Hong Kong, in Malaysia, in Japan, in Korea, and in China. At the Beijing Forum, there was a somewhat puzzling phenomenon that the medical humanities that were being taught in the elite medical schools in Peking and elsewhere offered their students plenty of Tolstoy and quite a lot of Renaissance European painting. But there was no works in Chinese language or culture, and there were no paradigms being offered from this really alternative moral and philosophical perspective. Equally striking in this period was the absence of feminist scholarship, the kind of feminist scholarship that had ushered in constructionist perspectives and had been centred in the 1980s and 90s on theorising the body. So, and there was a disorienting sense that the medical humanities were being advocated for on the basis that exposure to literature and history and to works of art would provide an enhancement to the ethical and empathic aspects of doctors, while the people who actually worked in philosophy departments or were historians were not always the most empathic people in actual life. And in fact, when I come to think about it, many of those who have been serious abusers of power in history have also been lovers of fine art. Indeed, this question of empathy presented itself in this era in many puzzling ways. I've called this the problem of empathy as a sort of dominant motif of this period. So in a way, I'm suggesting that we had a kind of second or new single story about the medical humanities. And that single story was that by using art and literature in the humanities, there would be this promotion of empathy. And yet empathy was being understood as a purely cognitive characteristic that could be measured by a reductive instrument without any actual discussion or engagement with the philosophical literature that explored or underpinned or indeed had originated the term of empathy. There was no capacity to ask questions about how empathy was actually being used or played out in clinical spaces. And disabilities advocate and scholar Rebecca Garden argued that there were tendencies to objectify the patient as a spectacle of suffering through which the physician could exercise their own virtue by displays of empathy. Garden noted that the responsibility that physicians bear in caring for patients is in itself a mode of power. theories of empathy that emphasize interpersonal relations should not obscure the larger social contexts that determine illness and disability, beginning with inequities in access to and quality of healthcare based on ethnicity, class, gender, and sexual or affectional orientation. So this story, this single story about the medical humanities orienting to empathy was being called into question in part because of its failure to acknowledge that there were other, perhaps more primary stories, and that the empathy of the doctors was something that came, to use Adichie's comment, secondly. Nor was there any awareness of something that had been talked about in humanities scholarships for at least 30 years, which is that this dichotomous Western conceptual framework remained not only undisturbed, but entirely unnoticed in the medical humanities scholarship around empathy and around other aspects of learning. And if you're not familiar with that dichotomous Western conceptual framework, you have only to think about the ways in which Western ways of thinking have tended to position things as if they were opposite from each other, to separate the mind and the body, to think of nature and society as distinct and separate, to see the cognitive as distinct from or even endangered by the emotional, to make a difference between the acting subject and the passive object who is acted upon, between the hard sciences and the soft humanities, between the knower and the known, the rational and the irrational, those who can think in abstractions, those who think concretely. And it should not take you much to consider that these line up with how we think about the doctor, active, with abstract thought, the knower, the subject, the one who has culture and education, versus the patient, passive, naked, part of nature, a body. And also, of course, that this is gendered and represents the ways in which the world has structured things according to lining things up or aligning them with what is considered masculine and what is considered feminine. And all of this had been hotly debated in humanities scholarship for some 30 years, and yet was somehow absent, as if it had never been, in the medical humanities of that period. At the Beijing Forum, all of these uneasinesses, our concerns as scholars, our worries were discussed. And this led us in 2011 to the notion of a critical medical humanities. So it was an issue of the BMJ Journal Medical Humanities that explored critical aspects of the humanities along these issues. So that is my second moment. So my first moment says that medicine acquired a second story, the story of the patient. And then my second moment is that the medical humanities had a single story, and it was about the cultivation of humanistic practice centered on empathy. And it was beginning to have that story questioned and to ask what it might not be seeing, because that story does not address what came first. It is a story of what came secondly. Let me move now to my third and final moment then. I've called this moment Critical Care, and it takes its inspiration from the title. Critical Care is the title of a recent little book by arts and health scholar and practitioner Clive Parkinson from Manchester in the UK, and it takes us up to the present moment. So what happens then after 2011? Well, I've said 100 flowers bloomed. This is really when the medical humanities really expanded over the past decade. And the Edinburgh Companion to the Critical Medical Humanities, led by scholars at the Wellcome Centre for the Medical Humanities at Durham, exemplifies the absolute explosion of scholarship in humanities departments and among scholars who considered themselves now working in the medical humanities. And the body came into focus for the first time. The problem with scholarship, and in particular the problem with formal ethical reasoning, is that it is entirely cognitive. It's located entirely in the head. It celebrates the beautiful and athletic acts of scholarship, but when we're talking about medicine and the medical humanities, it is the body, its uniqueness, its leakages, its abjectness, its emotions, its inconsistencies, its biased, non-rational brain that surely must be central and was so missing. Pardon me if I suddenly collapse back from a general to a personal narrative at this point, because all of this came into focus for me by working at this point with experimental performance artists, the kind whose work was never utilised in actual medical humanities teaching, which vastly preferred Tolstoy, George Eliot, Oliver Sacks, people of a fine, fluent prose. Whereas, of course, experimental performance art is always, among other things, extremely discomforting. I learned quite a lot from performance artist and cancer survivor Brian Lobel. His website is called Global Warming, B. Lobel, Global Warming. He had testicular cancer at the age of 19 and wrote an extremely funny performance piece called Ball and Other Funny Stories About Cancer, and as a result of it. He has a recent collection out called Theatre and Cancer that I absolutely recommend. Even better is going to see him perform if you get the opportunity. He now heads a centre at Bruford College, Rose Bruford College in the UK. What Ball brought into view was the way in which in cancer care, nothing has been ever about really getting back to normal. There never was, says Brian. Brian says that the body doesn't return to a pre-cancer state, even when you are a survivor. Cancer affects your mindset, your worldview, your work, relationships. It affects your economies. It affects your insurance. There was never one way to have a body, and there's nothing wrong with an imperfect body. And so there are reasons why someone might want to, as he has done, to hold on to a cancer history. There is a moment in Ball where Brian undresses, places a towel around his waist, and invites 4 volunteer members of the audience to come and stand before him, reach under the towel, and palpate his testicles. After that, they are to give a qualitative description of what they have found. This is a breathtakingly vulnerable moment, participated in by the 4 volunteers, by the actor, and by the somewhat breathless watching audience. It is through the participation in that moment that we come to experience collectively the understanding that we're all only temporarily able-bodied. And so the concerns of the disabled, as is the case right now here in Australia with the vaccine rollout, are actually not concerns only of those capital O others that are not us, located perhaps in residential care homes, but that we ourselves are fundamentally connected to the same processes and structures, those structures that give us single stories about the disabled and the power to tell that story, and the institutional and funding arrangements that reinforce it, that mean that we create disability in the world. Disabilities, of course, does not reside in the body, but in the social circumstance that body finds itself in, something again that was overlooked by the medical humanities. As we are running short on time, I will hold myself back from telling another one of my favourite stories about Brian's performance art, except to say that when the last US election had occurred, Brian and one of the early acts of the new Trump administration was to suggest that, to pass a bill that would likely have denied health insurance to any of those with pre-existing conditions, that Brian said to the world through a recent performance, "I see you and your pre-existing conditions. Your pre-existing conditions are what make you, and they are beautiful." And his sharp critical analysis of power in the world intersecting with radical compassion and an ethics vested in the body and in relationship is what performance art can help bring to disrupt the single stories of bioethics and the medical humanities. I thought about this in relation to the work that we were doing. We were holding, in the context of physician suicide, normalized teaching by humiliation, which is experienced or witnessed by almost 90% of medical students in Australia, and severe illness-inducing burnout, we were holding theatre skills workshops for medical students and junior residents. These explored ethical performance, not by asking people to role play difficult moments such as breaking bad news, but by working with their most basic building blocks in the body: how you carry yourself, the qualities of your voice, how you play social status in relations to those you interact with, the seriousness of touch. And we could see how confronting and vulnerable it was for medical students and junior doctors, those who live so much in their own heads, to work through the confrontations of the body. We were drawing from Boalian ideas about theatre and agency, about the capacity to induce change by changing spectators into spect-actors. And I'd like to acknowledge that the theatre of the oppressed has very recently and is now a significant modality for exploring medical ethics in India. And they hold lessons for academics too, because we also pretend that we have not bodies when we do our work. This work has culminated in the production of a verbatim theatre play drawn and created entirely from the works of medical students and doctors themselves, called Grace Under Pressure, which is currently resuming its COVID-disrupted national tour and will soon be coming, I hope, to a theatre near you. That includes Queanbeyan for those of us who live in the ACT, and also playing in Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland. This brings us to the present day. So, I have a quote, a Latin quote here, which ironically enough, the Zoom screen is preventing me from reading to you. It's chosen because it's discussed in Paul Rothfield's book, The Art of Law in Shakespeare, which talks about representations of law and nature being changed and transformed one from the other. And it begins, corona est quasi cor. The crown is, as it were, like an adorned heart. Coronavirus has laid bare to all of us in these darkest terms that black and brown lives don't matter. And the rest of that that quote says that the ornaments of the heart are mercy and justice. And that in fact, they are among the many, the disabled, the mentally ill, First Nations communities, women, the addicted, those that bear trauma, chronic pain in the body, are all people who are identifiably poorly served and have worse outcomes in medicine and healthcare. And it turns out that those same processes that produce that kind of disenfranchisement poorly serve doctors also. What I have learned from this, and for those of you watching, what I have up here are images from the scrub choir at the Royal Melbourne Hospital. This scrub choir produced many YouTube clips all the way through COVID and found ways to sing together despite the danger of aerosol transmission. I learned that although the medical humanities have been focused on producing better outcomes through cultivating the empathy of doctors, what I really discovered by preparing this talk is that the medical humanities is full of the voices of doctors in pain. Doctors who are yearning, wounded, desirous, exhausted, probing, and dedicated. Doctors who are also victims of the continued coloniality of medicine. To draw on the works of Quijano, coloniality is a living legacy of colonialism, inextricably and intersectionally bound to racism, heteropatriarchy, bodyism, geography, and to extractive capitalism. And those same processes that displace the patient from care whilst producing really extraordinary capacities to intervene beneficially also exhaust and displace the physician. And so these issues have been taken up by Alan Bleakley in his recent work, Medical Humanities and Medical Education, which draws on the work of French scholar Jacques Rancière to link a political call to democratise medical practice with an aesthetic call to promote the education of what he calls sensibility. Medical education produces insensibility, either consciously to maintain existing power structures or unconsciously, for example, as a defence against ambiguity. Medical humanities, he argues, is a primary form of resistance to that insensibility. And so I think the task now of medical humanities is that we can now do as Stella Polaki has suggested and understand illness as many narratives, as multiple. And I have been in love with this book since it first came out, and I reviewed it in 2016. I lent it to everybody and I can't stop singing its praises. I just absolutely adore it. And indeed it is because she suggests that it is the task of the medical humanities to stop starting the story from that second place of the doctor and the physician, but instead to bring into focus the conditions and structures and processes of oppression that create illness into our multiple, enriched, creative, resistant conversation. And to ask, what demands, if any, does a narrative make for the people who encounter it? And how can those demands be met? And it is in this way that we can start to ensure that patient-centered care is multiple stories that join the experience, the compassion and the health of the doctors to those that they care for. Thank you so much. Do come visit our website at the Arts Health Network, which is one word, www.artshealthnetwork.com.au. And I'd love to hear from you and to hear how your own work explores the many stories of illness and of healthcare out there in the world.